do it.
Okay, webinar is now streaming live on YouTube. Jeff, does that mean we are broadcasting?
No,
Well,
it's
he
just
not-
it's just us in here.
I think Nick is joining. I see his name.
Great.
Nick, are you here? He may need to be unmuted or so we can see his video.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Yeah.
Okay. Jeff, you are the host. Can you please turn on?
Yeah, we want to
Nick's
check the
camera.
lighting and all. Thanks, Nick.
Sure. And then we have a separate link.
Rick, your lighting is great.
Okay. Hopefully Jeff's hearing this because nothing's happening with Nick.
Right.
I see
Yeah.
Andrew trying to connect.
Give us a minute, Nick. And
Hey, all right.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff here.
okay,
What do we need with Nick?
we need his video to be shown so we can see how that works.
Yeah, when I try to hit start video, it says unable to start video. You can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, let me see what I can do with that. Oop.
Looks like we lost him.
We got time. We're okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here they come.
Mhm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So now I see our name, my name up there, but it's still when I hit start video, it says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Right. Jeff, you have two different panelists, I think, going. One of them is host and the other one is just a regular panelist. I need you to jump on the host one if you can.
Yeah, I'm there. There we go. You should be able to do that now, Nick, if you try it again.
Oh, here we
Oh,
are.
there we go.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
The second link is for later on, right?
Yes.
And so let me make sure I have that second link right handy. Who did that link come from?
Wendy?
It came from Illinois Holocaust Museum.
It wasn't from Matthew Sacco per se.
So
I can go in and resend it to you right now.
Yeah, that would be great.
yeah,
That
that
would be
might
great.
be
You got it.
because
My pleasure. And then you won't have to look for it.
yeah.
Right, okay.
Doing that, be taken care of in a moment.
Sure, that'd be great.
Carol, you're a little cut off in the image.
Yeah, that's because I'm hogging the screen as I try to to close some things here. Just want to have as few things open as need be. Can I close this one?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Jeff, can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Yeah, you did hear that I'm gonna ask you to play the trailer shortly after I start after Wendy's intro, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and second, since I guess I'm a co-host, I was told through Linda that I can just, add my video back and unmute myself toward the end of Wendy's remarks. What about Nick and Cheryl? Are you going to do that for them? When
I'll be here and be available to do that, but they should be able to have that power as well. So
that's
should be
fine.
fine.
You know,
So-
Nick
So that-
and Cheryl, just for your benefit, when we start after the intro, I'm gonna, you know, commend you guys for the great research you did and talk a little about how your book's gonna be a PBS documentary and check local listings. And then I'm gonna suggest that we play the trailer, which
Great.
I guess is 2 minutes plus. And then hopefully, Jeff, while that's going on, you turn them on so I can immediately start the conversation dialogue after the trailer.
And how long will we do the conversation and then open it up to people, to the audience?
Wendy, what are we talking about? 35 minutes?
Yes,
Okay,
we
perfect.
should leave. Rick and Nick and Cheryl, we should leave. Keep an eye on the clock, Rick, that the program will conclude at 7:30 in 1 hour. So we should have the Q&A by 7:15, 7:10 at the latest.
Yeah, and Wendy's going to send me questions. You know, if either of you in the chat box see a question you want to hit on when we get there, you know, please feel moved by the moment. Otherwise, Wendy's going to send me questions and I will do that. And, you know, what we agreed to do in the Princeton Harvard session after, I think in that, even though I think we have over 700 people in the main session, in the smaller session, Wendy and Linda were talking about
About 50.
about 50 people. People can be, you know, shown their video, but we want to ask them to put their question or a thumbnail of it in writing first. This way we can avoid speechifying or other issues
a good
that
idea.
come up, and then they can either have it asked through the chat room or directly themselves to you. So.
And we'll try not to take the presidential debate as our model for
Yeah, right.
civil
Indeed.
communication.
I did something last night with Preet Bharara and introducing him. I said, I can promise you this, the event is both live and will be better organized than the presidential debate the night prior. Quite right. You did hear, by the way, I guess we're not live, that Trump said that he may not follow
Yeah.
state changes, which are simply adhering to the rules he agreed to and violated originally.
Well, he says but he didn't know anything about agreeing to the rules. So,
Oh, I see. I see.
right, of course. Right?
That explains it.
Nick and Cheryl, I just want to introduce you to Amanda. She's our Assistant Director of Education, Princeton graduate who is going to lead that wonderful reception afterwards.
Excellent.
Terrific.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Amanda.
I just realized I hadn't been able to turn on my video before, like you weren't, and so I just figured out that I could. So
I have a quick question, Jeff and Amanda. I just emailed Nick and Cheryl the link for the reception. I know you did something to make,
the link is not affected, but
It's not
it's the same
effective.
link. We changed which of
Right.
our accounts is hosting, but the link is the same.
Oh, okay.
So
Oh, okay.
yeah, so that won't be a problem.
So
And
will
Cheryl, Mimi Murley is joining us tonight.
Oh, okay.
So she'll be in the reception later. She's planning to say hi, but I
Oh,
wanted to make sure
terrific.
that I told you that.
Excellent.
So just a logistical question.
Mhm.
When this is over, will we leave this meeting and then immediately rejoin
Mhm.
it again? Okay.
Oh, the
Exactly.
same link.
So
Yes.
so we'll end this meeting and then you'll click the second link and go right into the second meeting.
and
Okay.
it's in your email with a red exclamation point.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Wendy.
Can I ask a
Awesome.
simple question? If the second link is the same as the first, what prevents people?
It's not the same link.
Okay, it's a
It's not the
different.
same link.
So people in the
Links.
first can't carry and stay in the second.
Correct.
Not that
The-
it should matter.
The change that we made didn't change the link that we're using. So the link we sent out to everyone is still in effect. That's what we meant by same, but it's a different link than this event.
Right. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Always
Actually, I'm going to close
The
the
light,
window
yeah,
here
that's right.
because
There's a
we're on
delay.
the farm now, and so there may be some authentic noises like dogs barking or
Well, there's definitely a lot of sun, which is nice.
Great.
make
Well,
it-
listen, thank you again, Nick and Cheryl, and we'll be on in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much.
Linda, do you want to say
Wendy,
something?
you want me to, take off my video too, since we're
Yeah,
there?
I think everyone should take off their video and
Wendy?
Yeah.
Can you see the shared screen?
yep,
Okay, great.
So,
And Wendy? Oh, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
I should hit stop video then, and then hit start video again when?
when Rick when Rick comes on after my opening remarks.
Yeah, we'll show the trailer, Nick, and when the trailer is running, you could turn it on because it'll run 2 minutes, and I'm not going to ask you anything until after.
Okay, so I'll turn the video off now, and then I'll mute myself shortly whenever you say is the right moment, and then turn both the sound and video on again, at some point toward the end of the trailer.
Sounds great. I'm going to mute myself too, Wendy and Linda, and thank you, Jeff.
Okay,
And
thank you.
Amanda.
Jeff, are you there? Jeff?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, can you please start the broadcast? You have the control now.
Oh, yes,
Thank you.
starting now.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our program. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our program. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Good evening, everyone. I am Wendy Singer, Director of Education of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, Board of Directors, staff and volunteers, I am honored to welcome each of you to today's program. As an institution grounded in the history and lessons of the Holocaust that works to share universal lessons of humanity and generate awareness and action against injustices worldwide, it is a pleasure to share this very special book and author event, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, by Nick Kristof and Cheryl Wudunn, moderated by Museum Vice President of our Board of Directors at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, Rick Solomon. Husband and wife duo, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wudunn, were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer Prize in journalism and have written a series of best-selling books together, as well as appeared in television documentaries of their books. Their #1 bestseller, Half the Sky, called Electrifying by the Washington Post, draws a compelling picture of trials and triumphs of women struggling worldwide for opportunity and equality. They followed that with A Path Appears, again, both a best-selling book and PBS documentary, exploring how people can make a difference at home and abroad. In their new book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, which came out this year in 2020, they issue a plea to address the crisis in working class America, while also focusing on solutions to mend a half-century of government failure. A two-time Pulitzer Prize winning columnist for the New York Times, Christoph is often called a reporter's reporter for his activism and was the subject of the 2009 Sundance Film Festival documentary Reporter. He has lived on 4 continents, reported on 6, and traveled to 140 countries, all 50 states, every Chinese province, and every main Japanese island in order to offer a compassionate glimpse into global health, poverty, and gender in the developing world. As part of Half the Sky, the Half the Sky documentary series, Christoph traveled around the world along with celebrity activists, America Ferrara, Diane Lane, Eva Mendes, Meg Ryan, Gabrielle Union, and Olivia Wilde to meet inspiring individuals confronting the global oppression of women. The first Asian American to win a Pulitzer Prize, Wu Dun is a business executive, entrepreneur, and best-selling author. She has special expertise in China, entrepreneurship, impact investing, and helping companies do both well and good. She is co-founder of Full Sky Partners, which advises healthcare and technology companies that also have social impact. And she is a principal at Grayson's Partners USA, a firm focusing on young healthcare and diagnostics companies. Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dun love telling stories that surprise and persuade. Before we begin our conversation, we wanted to let you know that there will be a Q&A, question and answer period after their conversation. Please submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There are over 700 people registered for tonight's program, and people are here from around the nation. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. And now I welcome our moderator, our very own Rick Solomon.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for that fine introduction. I would like to start, Nick and Cheryl, by commending your extensive research in Tightrope. As you informed me, your wonderful book, which I highly recommend to everyone reading, will air also as a PBS documentary scheduled for broadcast nationally on October 26th. Please check your local listings. We're going to now play a 2-minute trailer to set the scene for our discussion from the documentary. Jeff, if you could do that.
One of my most powerful memories from childhood is the number 6 school bus. But this memory is also tinged with sadness, because today about 1/4 of the kids who rode that bus with me are no longer alive.
Honestly, it just sucks, man. I had everything I wanted in my early 20s. I have nothing now.
We can get prostitutes, we can get drugs. This is no place for a child to be, even an adult.
I mean, I heard he sort of blew himself up making meth,
Yeah. Left a big hole in the world, left in my heart, too.
I'm Nicholas Kristof. My wife, Cheryl, and I have worked together for decades, covering some of the greatest injustices of our time.
Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dun. Their coverage won them a Pulitzer Prize.
But we've become increasingly shocked by what's been taking place here in America.
Now, Nick and I are traveling across the country into the heart of communities battling despair.
America is unique when it comes to inequality. We are the richest country on the planet with the worst poverty. That's who we are.
My wife said, "Please call me." That's all she wrote. That text message, I knew my brother was dead.
You're taught that anyone who uses these drugs are evil people. You're not given any indication that these are people who are dealing with health issues.
We're in the worst affordable housing crisis in years, maybe decades.
So 4 families living in a single wide.
Yes. We want to understand how so many people fell through the cracks and what can be done to change things.
I'm not rich. I have 2 roommates. I don't own my house. I barely own a running car. But there needs to be people that are willing to say, hey, let me help you.
I think it takes a village for someone to succeed. If it wasn't for the support, I don't think I would have just done it.
Whether or not there will be opportunity for everyone, that's the question that we're facing right now as a nation.
So it's time for a new version of the American dream, one that includes everybody.
Welcome, Nick and Cheryl, to our program. We're delighted to have you. I believe you're Zooming right now from Oregon. Is that right?
That's right. We are.
We're on the family farm. We just wish we could be there physically at the museum.
As do we. Future time for sure. So let's get into it a little. Disappointing jobs, lack of adequate health care, drug dependency, alcoholism, depression, suicide, lack of education, spiraling out of control. A balancing act that you so aptly name a tightrope walk for many working class families in both rural and urban America. Tell us a little, Nick, if you would, about Bus Line 6 in Yamhill, Oregon, where, as you point out in the documentary, fully a quarter of your classmates that were on the bus with you are no longer alive.
Yeah, so Yamhill here is a little farm town, a population 1,000 on a good day. It was an area that had done very well for most of the 20th century. The biggest employers are logging, farming, and light manufacturing. Like my neighbors right down the hill from us here, the people who got on the bus right after me each morning were the Knapp kids, 5 Knapp kids. Farland was my grade. His younger brother, Zeelan, brother Nathan, baby brother Keelan, and sister Regina. And their dad, by virtue of a good union job laying pipe, they'd been able to buy their own house. When Farland turned 16, his family got him a Ford Mustang, and we were all incredibly jealous of Farland. But those kinds of jobs, those kind of good union jobs, disappeared in Yamhill, as they did in Baltimore, in Maine, and Kentucky, all over the country. And Farland, after he lost his job, he went into a downward spiral. He self-medicated. He died of liver failure from using drugs and alcohol. His brother Zeelan died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. His sister Regina died of hepatitis from injecting drugs. And Keelan, the youngest, was alive at the time the book came out. But in March, as COVID was spreading, he self-medicated, he lost his job, and he died of a heroin overdose. And so all 5 kids who a generation earlier had exemplified this sense of upward mobility and looking forward to the future, all gone now, even though their mother is still alive. And that's a microcosm of what has happened in so many communities around the country.
You know, with Keelan, if I recall from the book, you wrote that he spared himself by going to prison, but now, as you describe and update us, he's died since. So before we get to you, Cheryl, on some aspects of this, I have to ask the question, Nick. Tell us how you were different. You grew up in the same milieu. You lived on a sheep and cherry farm. Yet you went to Harvard, if I recall, and you also were a Rhodes Scholar and a multiple Pulitzer Prize winner. So what gives?
You froze for just a moment, but I think I got that. I think it's maybe at our end. So I was geographically aligned with my classmates, but not socially. So my parents were professors who commuted to Portland. So the Knapp kids, I don't think they had a single book in their house. My house is surrounded by books. My parents hugged me. Mr. Knapp was firing guns at Mrs. Knapp and brutally beating her up. Those kids were deeply traumatized. Mr. Knapp was an alcoholic. And so I think that, you know, I won the lottery of birth with my parents, and it was assumed that I would graduate from high school, that I would go on to college. And I do think that if I had been in that Knapp household, then my trajectory would have been entirely different. And if Farland had been in this household, it would have been completely different. And Farland might now be talking here about poor Nick Kristof. It's so much of our outcomes in America today depend on where we begin.
Indeed. And, you know, would you also say that you had meals and discussed things together, as well as the importance of education?
Yeah, I mean, there was so little physical distance separating me from my neighbors, and just this enormous gulf of a sense of community, of love, of intellectual stimulation. And we measure child poverty typically with metrics of income and wealth. I think in many ways one can make the argument that the more useful metrics of child poverty are how often a child is hugged or how often that child is read to. And I grew up by that standard in enormous wealth, and Farland in enormous poverty.
Indeed. You also have a great line, if I recall, in the book where your parents cherished poetry over carburetors. I think Goethe, the German poet. So well said. Cheryl, talk to us a little about the plight of the former neighbors of Nick and the folks in Yamhill in terms of how the situation that Nick has well described has been exacerbated by the pandemic and the recent fires, if I may ask.
Right. So first of all, I think it's really important to understand that when we were correspondents abroad, we did travel around the region and saw a variety of different types of backgrounds. We, interviewed people who were very, very wealthy, but also we interviewed people who were in extreme poverty throughout China, throughout Southeast Asia, throughout Asia. And we had been coming back once a year to Yamhill, partly on our vacation. And we had, been meeting with Nick's friends and other people who were from his high school. Some of the workers some of his former classmates were working on the farm, working on the family farm. But we had never really delved into their backgrounds. And so it was really important to see that when we started asking them questions, that's when we started seeing how precarious their lives were, just really bordering on the edge of barely able to have enough to eat and just falling off a cliff. So that's partly why we named it Tightrope, the book, because these people are walking on a tightrope. So if you can imagine these people walking on a tightrope before the pandemic, you can just imagine now what they are like. And that's why Keelan, what happened to him was so important, because Keelan actually was planning to be at a conference with us in the spring. He was so proud of the book, and he was proud to tell his story. He said, this is my family. I want to tell my family's story in person. So we were all planning it, something to look forward to, but the pandemic hit. And of course, he lost a job, and that not only, spiraled him into a psychological depression, but also there was no income. How embarrassing it was for him to rely on his mother's Social Security. So he was just, doing a lot more drugs. And we're not sure if it was fentanyl, but that is possible that that's what pushed them over the edge. And that's really important now because a lot of people during the pandemic, they're isolated. If they've lost their jobs, as 11 million people don't have their jobs anymore who did have jobs before the pandemic, if they can't find a job right away, then, and there are no more stimulus payments, they don't see, a light at the end of the tunnel. And so then it's very easy to get fentanyl now, which is so far cheaper than any kind of opioid drug we've seen on the marketplace. And you can imagine what's happening even before the pandemic. The deaths of despair, which are sort of deaths that are named by Angus Deaton and Ann Case, two economists at Princeton. Even before the pandemic, the deaths of despair were really, almost at their record high for the last 3 out of 4 years. Our life expectancy for all Americans had gone backwards, which is not what's happened at any of the other Western countries. But of course, with COVID, that has changed the entire picture. But it also means that probably deaths of despair have skyrocketed. And unless we recognize that, I don't think there's going to be a turnaround. And we are so focused on COVID right now. We're so focused on the actual disease, but the disease may actually spread. We'll have a pandemic among people in the US who may not ever catch COVID. It's a different pandemic. It's a pandemic of isolation, of depression, of suicide, of despair.
Indeed, and layer onto that, because we talked the other day about, the searing fires in the area and otherwise, and what toll that is taking, if I may.
Right. The fires are also a very sad, situation. Actually, the fire there was a big fire in our region that came within 5 miles of our farm where we are right now. So it has affected so many people economically because all of their crops actually were really negatively affected if you hadn't if you haven't harvested before then. And that's an indication that we do as policymakers need to take more specific and targeted action on things that will actually protect our lands. I know there's a big debate. We heard it on the debate between President Trump and Joe Biden on climate change. You have to do all these things. It's not just something you have to address the climate change. It's not just climate change, but it also isn't just forest management. It's all of those things. We have to actually manage the forests better, but we also need funding. If you cut funding that you're using to manage the federal forests, how on earth do you think that they're going to be managed better? And so, at the same time, you also need to, come up with a much more practical and realistic climate change policy, and not just, on principle, pull out of the Paris Accord and say, I don't believe that's real. I mean, it's just not a practical, approach.
Indeed. Let's widen the aperture a little. Cheryl and Nick, your research took you elsewhere in the United States, other rural and urban communities. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, one of the striking things in that, back in the 1990s, when communities like Yamhill, and I think in a lot of white America, when people looked at the struggles in African American communities, there was a kind of a glib scornfulness and a lot of talk about bad choices and deadbeat dads and junkies and this kind of thing. And meanwhile, the great Harvard sociologist William Julius Wilson said, no, it's about jobs. It's about jobs, losing jobs in communities. And he was exactly right, because when jobs left Yamhill and when they left Kentucky and when they left Maine and West Virginia, then you saw very, very similar pathologies. And I don't think that my own progressive community adequately appreciated the importance of a job, not only as an income stream.
Did you freeze?
Of losing those jobs. And so one sees, these very similar patterns across the country. And yet it hasn't gotten, from our point of view, enough attention, which is one reason we wrote Tightrope. I spent a lot of time reporting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and those were important stories that had to be addressed. But every 2 weeks in America, we lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we lost in 19 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those deaths here at home on the home front, that pain on the home front, I don't think has been adequately acknowledged or addressed.
But I also think that it's important to see in terms of the pandemic, because we've had 200,000 people die. And it's not just in the short term, we've got to better manage the pandemic. We absolutely have to. But in the long run, we also need to have better healthcare. We need to have more people who are much healthier so that they aren't as susceptible to dying from this kind of the disease. If you have chronic diseases like diabetes, or if you have, lung diseases, you're obviously much more susceptible to dying from COVID. If you're in better health, you have a fighting chance to survive it. But partly because our healthcare is really not, ideal, to say the least. A lot of people don't have access to healthcare, and so over the years, their chronic diseases build up. And this is a real issue, and I think that it isn't surprising that the U.S. has had more deaths per capita than other Western countries.
Sure. Two books that you mentioned in your own book, and perhaps you want to comment on this. One, Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. For those on the call, he comes from Appalachia. I'm simplifying this. It goes into the military, ends up at Yale Law School, among other venues. Educated, a book by Tara Westover, who comes from Idaho, who was influenced by the Mormon Church and also going to university, ending up at Cambridge University. So how did that type of research factor into your own work and thinking, and did you interact with them, if I may?
Tara is a friend, and Tara Westover, and we, enormously admire her, and we enjoyed Hillbilly Elegy. I think, frankly, from my point of view, Hillbilly Elegy emphasizes a little bit too much the personal responsibility narrative that people get in trouble because of bad choices. And I think that's true, but I think that those bad choices follow from a trajectory that is, that starts early. And my neighbors made plenty of bad choices, but we as a society, you as taxpayers, paid an awful lot of money to incarcerate them rather than to educate them, rather than to provide them with job training, rather than to provide them with drug treatment, all of which I think would have been more effective. And in America, when you can look at a zip code and make a good guess about what will happen to that child decades down the road, then that's not because that infant is making bad choices. It's because we as a society are making bad choices about the support that child gets. And it does strike me that both Tara and JD, in some respects, were rescued by institutions. And for JD, that was the military. For Tara, that was Brigham Young and the Mormon Church. And there are so many talented kids out there who are literally dying, or at least certainly not living up to their potential, because they aren't getting that kind of support. There's an adage that Cheryl and I, that means a lot to us, that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. Talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And I think the challenge for our country and for policymakers is to try to do what we can to nurture that talent by providing that opportunity.
But I think it's really important for us not to always think of, oh, that means big government. Just mind you, we've lived in China. We have seen the way big government operates, and it's not something that I am totally fond of either. It has its challenges, but you need targeted assistance. So, for instance, one way to illustrate that is what happened after the financial crisis when auto workers were laid off, both in Detroit and also in Canada, in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, often by the same company. So you actually got to compare how the different systems, treated or handle this issue. So in the U.S., a lot of auto workers were laid off. They got, robust unemployment insurance because of the special circumstances. The U.S., bumped up the unemployment insurance, but they lost their health care because that came with the job. Over in Canada, the same company laying off people in Canada, well, they lost their job. They didn't lose their health care because they have national health care in Canada, but also the government, kicked in and said, okay, we know how impactful this can be if a whole bunch of people in the town lose their jobs. What other areas, industries, is there a need for people, for labor? And they discovered that healthcare had a huge need. And so they helped facilitate training programs so that some of these auto workers could train to retrain to get jobs in the healthcare industry. So, just after a few years, you got these Canadians who they relied on the government for a little bit, but they're now back on their feet because they've got jobs. They don't have problems with healthcare. Back in the US, we all know what happened to Detroit. It's taken years and years and years to recover. It's now much more vibrant. But those families, they also lost their health care, and finding a job in a town where the biggest employer just laid off a whole bunch of people, that is extremely hard. And there was very little job retraining assistance. So I think that's much more important for us to understand that we're looking for, when we're trying to propose, programs, whether it's government or larger institutions that are targeted for certain outcomes, not just a big government that's there just to invade your life and be there forever.
Important point. You both are very telepathic, because Cheryl, you raised the issue of training programs, and I'm going to get into that. But the next line I was going to ask about, Nick, was the quote you had. I have it on my script here. Talent is usual, opportunity is not. And so, it's about the lottery of birth, as you say. But let's touch on for a minute before we go to prescriptions, U.S. standing in the world. You point out that of the 161 countries in the world, most of which you both visited, on the Social Progress Index, the U.S. ranks 40 in child mortality, 61 in high school enrollment, among other stats. Either of you, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So we tend to think of the U.S. as number one. We're number one, and of course we are number one in number of aircraft carriers, in military capacity, in cultural impact, in many ways in technology. In medical technology, we're roughly number one at our best, and yet we're something like number 95 in access to healthcare. And of course, 3 million fewer Americans have health insurance today than did in February before the pandemic, because just when people most needed that coverage, then they lost their jobs, and as a result, their health insurance as well. American kids are 55% more likely to die by age 19 than kids in other OECD countries and other advanced countries. Women are 2 or 3 times as likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth in the US than in Europe. And education was something, mass education was what we in the US invented. Europe had Eden, they had Oxford. We did the mass high school. We did the mass tertiary education. And yet, since the 1970s, so many other countries have eclipsed us. And again, we seem myopic about that. There was a lot of good talk in the Democratic primaries about improving college access, which is crucial, but there was very little conversation about the fact that 1 in 7 American kids still doesn't graduate from high school. And those kids are cooked.
Well, so it's really important because I think people say, oh, well, so who cares about some index? Well, it is important because if you look at our global standing and our competitiveness in the world, we've got China looming with 1.4 billion people. We've got India with soon to have 1.4 billion people. If we're looking at just the elite, they're going to be far more competitive than we in the US. So what does that mean? That means that here in the US, we want to lift up every American so that each American can be operating at his or her fullest capacity possible, so that we can, as a country, become, number one again. Let's put together Team USA and let's actually compete and get back to number one, and have everybody get with the team, regardless of whether you're red or you're blue, or whatever flavor you are in politics. It's really important that if we want to maintain the standard of living that we have, the entire country has to move up. And so that means trying to help your fellow American so that we can, once again, get to number one on so many of these different fronts.
Before we get into prescriptions, one other quote in your book to ask you to comment on quickly. And the quote is, "The American economy has dazzled. The world and its stock market has created great riches, but the median American household is actually poorer in net worth today than it was in 2000. So my question to you is the American dream with the lot of each successive generation doing better than the last dying or dead in your view?
So I think that it's very much alive if people have a certain amount of educational capital, for example, if they get in the right household with the right parents, etc. But I think that for an awful lot, a third of Americans or something, where what people are struggling economically, but also struggling educationally, then I think there is less of that mobility around. And that for a country that prides itself on not having a class system, we in many ways do have an aristocracy, but it's not about gentry, it's not about title. It's really in a way about transmitting educational opportunities, which then correlate to income and standing. And that, I think, has become, the US in that sense has become more ossified. And I see that right here in Yamhill. I saw that with the kids on my bus. I see that with friends who are still struggling.
So let's touch on a little some of the prescriptions since our time is short. Early childhood education, drug treatment, focus on jobs retraining that you mentioned, Cheryl. Touch on that a little more or expand if you would.
Well, first of all, we think one of the most important interventions would be early childhood education, because you get more bang for your buck. Between the ages of 0 and 5, your brain is growing the fastest it will ever grow in a lifetime. And the brain architecture is developing. So when kids are born into families where there's abuse, when there's fighting, when there's actual, gunshots being fired, that's a problem for the baby. We always think of young kids as very resilient. Well, you know something? They are to an extent, but they're far less resilient than we think. And in fact, what's happening when there is child abuse and when there is, just this trauma in a household, it forces cortisol through the brain of the young child, just in the way that we have stress and cortisol starts, coursing through our brain. The same thing happens with little kids. The difference is that when the brain is actually developing, that cortisol impairs the development of the brain architecture. So you have this window where you really can help that kid get onto a better life trajectory. So we think that it's very important to focus on early childhood education, even starting earlier than that with the nurse family partnership home visitations, where you actually can basically give parental training. It's basically lessons in parenting to new mothers, often who are very young and just aren't prepared for raising kids. That's really critical. And then there are a few other policy prescriptions like baby bonds that actually will help families to focus on planning for the future, to save for education. And that's something that they should have as a goal, that their kid goes to school, goes to college, even plant that in their minds. And again, as you mentioned, yes, vocational training, job retraining is really important. We often are very dismissive of vocational training and job retraining. We think, oh yeah, well, we've tried that so many times, we've put so much money out for job retraining, they never work. Well, in fact, they do work. We've seen it in Europe, in Germany. There's lots of retraining, and it is very helpful. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of job retraining. We just never really focused on it. We didn't make it a priority and say, we're going to come up with a really good, useful job retraining. I gave you the example of what happened in Canada. There was a focused job retraining program. And vocational education is also important. We have in the past been dismissive of that, but not everybody is going to go to college. It's just not necessarily in the cards. But someone like Clayton Green or Farland Knapp, if they had had vocational training, that would have given them something to fall back on if they lost a job, or some sort of skills, trade skills that they could actually fall back on. That would have helped, and it also would have gotten them more used to actually more training or understanding that you have to train yourself to get to upskill and get a new job. And so I think it's important for the society to recognize that we need to allocate more funds for these kinds of programs.
Nick, do you want to add anything before I go to a question that you asked me to suggest?
No, go ahead. I'm trying to think what that question was.
Well, we talked about how some of these types of prescriptions are progressive and in some ways, perhaps, as we discussed, more identified with the Democratic Party, but you do have many of the folks in Yamhill and otherwise who are Trump voters. And I guess my question that we talked about is, how do you square that? And is there any room for a changed perspective?
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And people often ask me, how is it that folks could vote against their interests in this way? And one of the people we talk about in the book is my old 7th grade questionnaire mayor, who is, really smart, really hardworking, really talented, but just struggled for many years with alcohol and with drugs, spent 7 years homeless. And so she knows better than any of us, the difficulties of the ways in which America's falling short. And we asked her once, so Mary, did you ever think there was a political solution to these kinds of problems? And she said, well, traditionally she didn't, but then in 2016 she did. And for the first time in her life, she voted for Donald Trump. And I guess I would say that places like Yamhill have voted disproportionately for Trump, and the white working class has voted for Trump. But I would note that it's really because of social conservatism, not economic policy. So the working class, whether black or white, tends to be socially conservative, but economically liberal. If the issue is abortion, they're more likely to favor Republicans. If the issue is same-sex marriage, the same. But if the issue is raising the minimum wage or expanding access to healthcare or providing early childhood Democratic. And African-American working class voters go to the polls and vote for Democrats because issues of racial justice trump those of abortion. White working class folks have tended to vote for Republicans because issues of guns or abortion have trumped those of the minimum wage. Frankly, this year, when we have 11.5 million people who had jobs in February who don't have jobs now, when so many people are struggling to put food on the table, I think that people are a little bit more likely to think of those economic interests when they cast their ballots.
Although I think it's also very important to understand that politics sometimes is divorced from the economy, in the sense that there are people who don't always know that the expanded Medicaid program that they are availing of was the result of Obamacare. And they just know that, oh yeah, there's this program that I can take advantage of. And then also, as a result of COVID, because of the lockdowns, a lot of people say, oh, that's the problem of the Democrats are the ones who shut down the economy. Trump has been trying to open the economy, but he can't because the Democrats want to shut down the economy. So I do think that there is sometimes justification for just being on the team, on the right team. And they think of the red team versus the blue team. And often I think what happens is that people think the leader, the top leader, the president, is so divorced from anything that would affect them that they aren't quite sure, if voting really makes a difference, their vote. So they might as well vote for the person they like. That if it's a personality contest, they like Trump because he's this, crazy guy who's, almost like them in the sense that, he's against the establishment. And so are they because they're outside of the establishment. So I think there's a little bit of that going on, as well as, whether or not they identify with, economic liberalism or not.
Sure. Two other quick questions before we take it to audience questions. One, given the amount of racial injustice and other issues in this country, are there parallels to the race issues affecting the Black community in Yamhill and beyond of a race class issue at play?
So I'd say that, a place like Yamhill is overwhelmingly white. And so there tends to be a lot of hostility, not so much toward African Americans as toward Latino immigrants. And there's Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric went over very well among working class folks here because they believe that immigration has been taking away their jobs. And, if you're struggling, if you've lost jobs, you've seen your real pay decline, then you welcome a scapegoat. And I think Trump appealed to them on that front. I think that, on the question of African-American and white working class voters, they have traditionally kind of worked at odds, both in terms of who they vote for, at least since Reagan, and in some ways in the private sector, that white labor unions often excluded Black workers. Bobby Kennedy made a really heroic effort to bring the white and Black working classes together to recognize their shared interest. And I would love to see the Democratic Party obviously already has made common ground with African-American workers. I think that many American progressives have kind of lost faith in the white working class because they voted for Trump, because they are perceived as, voting for conservatives ever since Reagan. I think it's a mistake to give up on them. And I think sometimes progressive rhetoric about how these folks are bigots and racists and lost causes, I think simply increases the likelihood that they are going to vote for Republicans again, not only in the presidential race, but in Senate races, House races, and local races.
So last question before we go to audience questions. Our museum, and one day you will come there and we'll show it to you, world-class institution.
We look forward to that, Rick.
Indeed. Teaches people to be upstanders, proactive, positive forces for change. And you've written that many people feel psyched out, that they feel that they don't take any, it's about personal responsibility, or the problem of homelessness is simply too large, or it doesn't affect us or the US. Pick either one is wrong. So the question is, what can you do? And, very briefly, if you could give us a synopsis, you have an appendix to your book entitled 10 Steps That You Can Take in the Next 10 Minutes to Make a Difference. So share a little of that with us before I go to audience questions.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that people get psyched out, but there's so many reasons why they should not be. There has been enormous progress. And I think we often forget to talk about the progress because we want to say, oh, these problems are so large, we need help. But there has been enormous progress. More globally, there's been tremendous progress on poverty. So the percentage of people, or the numbers of people who are dying from malnutrition or what before the age of 5, because they don't get vaccinations or something like that, has dramatically fallen 60% since 1990. So if you're just looking at the past 25 years, that's going to be about 125 million children's lives saved. So that's huge progress. In some ways, it's never been a better time to be a young kid in the developing world. Now, COVID is changing a lot of that. I do fear that there is going to be a huge repercussion, not just from people in the developing world getting COVID. It's more from the aftermath of COVID spreading around the world, partly because a lot of programs to vaccinate children have been halted during the pandemic. And so that means a lot of children will not get their vaccinations. They're also, because the economy is not doing as well, that means a lot of these families who used to sell vegetables on the roadside or who used to be day laborers, they're just not going to get jobs. And so they can't feed their kids. They're going to sell their daughters, to other families as, in child marriages. So we're going to see some significant problems, but that is not to underestimate that we as a global force can't, change the world again, because we were making tremendous progress. Here at home, even, the rate of teenage pregnancy has declined dramatically. It's still too high, but it has declined dramatically. So that means a lot fewer kids born into homes that don't want these babies. And that's important because, as we talked about earlier, the early childhood education, it's so important. And if you don't want this kid, then the kid's not going to actually be treated very well. So I think that's, I think it's really important to understand that there is progress so that you shouldn't get psyched out. So in terms of some of the things that we talked about, 10 things that you can do in the next, 10 minutes, one is to get educated. Two is also to do something that we don't normally think of as helping out. And that's actually joining a group that might be focusing on advocacy. Sometimes you think that you always have to donate money, but advocacy is really powerful. And that means not just, you've got your own social media spotlight. You can, get your friends to recognize some of these issues, highlight these issues on your social media more than you normally do. Get a bunch of people together and start a book club. You can read there. I hear there's a book called Tightrope that might be very interesting. And you can come up with areas that you'd all like to, try and focus on and learn more about, and then maybe figure out a good way to try and do something about.
If people want to do something right away, then let me just suggest a few things practical things they can do. Reading Partners is a great organization that allows one to read to a particular child, help that child advance in reading. iMentor is a organization that allows one to mentor a kid who needs it. And iMentor means that it's particularly practical for a time of COVID. One can do it, on screen. And in terms of policy, then results.org is a terrific grassroots organization that advocates for smarter policies. And finally, fourth, and as important as anything, vote.
Indeed. You also mentioned sponsoring a child through Save the Children. And to your point, Cheryl, Tony Blair, for example, to your point about how results can make a difference, cut childhood poverty, I believe, in half while he was Prime Minister of the UK.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So let me go to a few questions from the audience here. So we have a question here. Do you think that city dwellers have lost touch and empathy with the people in small towns and rural areas? If so, what might be able to be done to change this? You touched on this already a little in your comments, Cheryl. Anything both of you would like to add?
I'd love to see some kind of a national service program that would mix people of different classes, of different geographies, of different political ideologies. And I don't think it works to make it mandatory. I just think that creates college paid for would be a terrific way to expand opportunity and also mix the country up a little bit.
Another question that's asked here, which touches on your go out to vote. How can we convince people on the tightrope to get out to vote for vital issues that seem to reject, which they reject often to their detriment? So any encouragement or thoughts on that?
So I think in part it's a function. I mentioned Bobby Kennedy earlier. He listened, so he went on listening tours, and there's a perception among a lot of working class voters that Washington politicians, and especially Democrats from cities, are coming and kind of lecturing them or hectoring them and not doing enough listening. And there's often also a barrier of faith that creates suspicions. I think that that really kind of doing a certain amount of listening would go over very well. And emphasizing these economic issues that, look, you may not agree with me on gun policy. You may not agree with me on Roe v. Wade, but that I'm sure you do agree with me on raising the minimum wage, which, you know, if the 1968 federal minimum wage had kept up with inflation and productivity, would now be $22 an hour. And so I think there are ways that, you know, they're not going to win over every working class white voter. They can sure make a difference.
And I would just add, you know, you've already got your Supreme Court justices. There's nothing more on that front to aim for. So you might as well now aim for a better economy and a higher minimum wage, expanded healthcare, because otherwise you might lose those things.
Absolutely. Let's touch on a term you use in your book a little, which also comes up in some of the questions: escape artists, people who rose above the dire circumstances that found them. On the issue that's been raised about can we have hope? Speak a little about too. Nick, you wrote about, I think in a host of columns, about Tani, the chess champion, homeless child, and his amazing story and trajectory, and a girl named Anne from Oregon, who I think will shock some of our audience in terms of who this is. Could you talk a little, one or both of you, about those two people, because they're frankly uplifting stories?
What you tell about Tani?
Okay, I'll tell you about Tani, and Cheryl can tell you about Anne. So Tani is a Nigerian refugee kid in the second grade in New York City. There was a chess program. It's unusual to have a chess program in elementary school like that, but it does. And he couldn't afford to join the chess club because he was homeless, but his mom asked for, and the school agreed to waive the fees to join. He promptly became a really brilliant chess player, and then won the New York State Chess Championship while living in his homeless shelter. And I walked with him from the school to his homeless shelter, carrying this huge chess trophy, you know, as tall as he was. And what struck me was that, you know, this is a family that was poor in resources, but so rich in emotional support, in love, in determination that Tani would get every opportunity and every advantage. And that school came through. I mean, they waived that chess club fee. They allowed him to go to tournaments without paying. They made sure he wasn't embarrassed because he couldn't buy sandwiches. And the result is that Tani's potential is able to be reached in ways that benefit us all.
So the story about Anne is really important because it's a story about how we, ordinary people, can actually change people's lives as well, and how targeted help can, and you know, I've talked about this, but targeted help can really be more powerful than you can ever imagine. So while Nick was growing up in Yamhill, Oregon, there was a young girl named Anne who was growing up in Southern Oregon, in Ashland. And so Anne was from a working class family. She was the oldest of 5 kids. Her parents did not go to college, working class all the way. And her father had been in the military, you know, had very conventional ways of looking at the world. And, you know, his kids didn't need to go to college. So she was in her senior year of high school, and she was walking down the hallway, and she saw a teacher. And the teacher said, okay, Anne, you know, where are you going to college? It was the spring of senior year, and everybody's asking that question. And she goes, oh, I'm not going to college, you know, because, you know, my father didn't go to college. We can't afford it. It's just much too expensive. And we're working class, and And the teacher looks at Anne and says, Anne, you come with me, and dragged her to the school office and said, you've missed most of the deadlines, but there are still a couple of universities that are open. I want you to go home, fill out this application. Ordered her to fill out an application. Well, so Anne went home. She filled out one application because the application fees were expensive. So she filled out University of Oregon. Well, of course she got in. And in fact, she got a scholarship from an organization. She went to college. She had odd jobs to help support her college fees. And, she even was a maid one time in a hotel. And, she studied journalism. And then after she graduated from college, she got a job at a local TV station, which was terrific. She was obviously very talented, and she did really well at that TV station. She kept going up and up and up. And obviously, we all know recently that Ann Curry was anchor for the Today Show. And it really goes to show that there are so many diamonds in the working class that we don't know about. And you never know when you're going to lift up the next Ann Curry. So open your eyes and see who you can help.
Excellent. And Nick, to your point with Tanny, if my memory serves me, people did reach out. They got a home. Bill Clinton met with them. I think there was a GoFundMe page that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there are good stories out there. There's no question. Let me ask one question about the press, because you say in your book, and I have a daughter who's a journalist, is there more that the press should do? On a daily basis, they're covering, God knows there's a lot of breaking news, but they're not telling the everyday stories. And would that, add heat and light to some of the attention and issues here?
Yeah, no, I think we can do a better job. And it always strikes me that the issues that we as a society do the worst job in addressing policy toward are those that are hard to talk about. It's domestic violence, it's drugs, anything to do with sex, it's mental health. And I think that it becomes incumbent upon us as journalists to try to break these taboos, to get people talking, to make people think about these, to project them onto the agenda. And, the fact that every 2 weeks, we lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we did in the entire Iraq and Afghan wars, with so little attention, so little thought. I think that's a shortcoming of us as journalists. And we tend to focus on something that we think of the news as what happens on a particular day. Sometimes the most important stories don't happen on a particular day, they happen every day. And I think we can do a better job highlighting those.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good place, I think, to stop. I'm going to turn it back. First, thank you so much, Cheryl and Nick. It was a pleasure. And I'm going to turn it back to Wendy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
And thanks, Wendy.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight for this meaningful and inspiring program. We do have a few more signed copies by Nick and Cheryl of Tightrope Americans for Reaching Hope in our gift shop, which is open in person or online on our website if you're interested. Please take a moment to fill out the survey that was placed in the chat. Your feedback is so important to us. And finally, our museum is open to the public Wednesdays through Sundays, 10 a.m. through 5 p.m. And our listing of upcoming public programs can be found at www.illinoisholocaustmuseum.org. Thank you guys so much. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.